The following program contains descriptions of real-world violence and a sensitive criminal case. It is intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. For 16 years, police across Europe hunted one of the most dangerous serial killers they had ever seen. She turned up at murders, armed robberies, burglaries, and even the shooting of a police officer. Her DNA was found at crime scenes across Germany, Austria, and France. Hundreds of investigators searched for her. Millions of dollars were spent trying to figure out who she was. But there was one problem. She never existed. This is the unbelievable true story of how forensic science created a ghost, and why believing that ghost allowed real killers to walk free. Welcome to the Forensic Strand. Today we look at the science behind modern history's most embarrassing police blunder, and the tiny mistake that sent 3 countries on a 16-year wild goose chase for a woman who never committed a single crime. Before we crack open this file, a quick note to our community. We read every single comment on this channel. Your theories and your insights drive our deep dives, so make sure to drop your thoughts below as the story unfolds. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's look at the evidence. In May 1993, the quiet German town of Idar-Oberstein woke up to a murder no one could believe. A 62-year-old woman named Lieselotte Schlenger was found dead inside her own living room. Someone had strangled her with a piece of wire used for keeping flowers in place. Neighbors were terrified. This was a peaceful town where people left their front doors unlocked and knew everyone on their street. When the detectives arrived, they found a scene with almost no clues. There were no broken windows, no missing money, and no messy footprints. The house was completely orderly, except for a porcelain teacup sitting on the table near the body. The investigators thought the killer might have picked it up or taken a drink before the attack. Forensic teams carefully took a swab from the rim of that cup. Back in the laboratory, scientists managed to pull a clean DNA profile from the saliva trace. It belonged to an unknown woman. They ran the sequence through the national database, but the computer monitor stayed completely blank. With 0 matches and no eyewitnesses, the case stalled. The file was packed away into a box, and the female profile sat quietly inside an evidence locker for 8 years. Then, in March 2001, hundreds of miles away in the city of Freiburg, Germany, the system suddenly flared back to life. A 61-year-old antique dealer named Joseph Walzenbach was found murdered inside his shop. This scene was much messier. The shop had been totally trashed, display cases were smashed, paperwork was scattered across the floor, and desk drawers had been violently pulled open. The killer had clearly been frantic, looking for quick cash or valuables. While dusting the wrecked shop for clues, investigators focused on a wooden kitchen drawer that had been pulled all the way out of its slot. They swabbed the handle where the intruder's hands had gripped the wood. When the lab ran the test, the results shocked the entire department. It was an exact match. It was the same unknown woman from the 1993 teacup. She had surfaced again, 8 long years later, and she was still killing. German police suddenly realized these 2 murders weren't isolated events. Someone or something connected them. But as the months rolled by, this mysterious woman began appearing in ways that made absolutely no sense to the detectives tracking her. Her DNA turned up on a discarded plastic syringe left behind after a late-night pharmacy break-in. A few months later, it appeared on the leather steering wheel of a stolen car abandoned on a highway. Soon after, it was lifted from a half-eaten cookie inside a broken-into garden shed. Then, the profile officially crossed the border into Austria, showing up at a string of messy backyard burglaries and trailer break-ins. The suspect made absolutely no sense to behavioral experts. One week she was a cold-blooded killer executing shopkeepers, and the next week she was a petty thief breaking into sheds to steal cheap electronics or eat snacks. The shadow was growing across the European map, but the human behind it remained completely invisible. Then everything changed. On April 25, 2007, the unknown woman's name became linked to something unthinkable. In the city of Heilbronn, Germany, a 22-year-old police officer named Michelle Kiesewetter and her male partner, were on duty. It was a warm, bright spring afternoon. They decided to pull their marked patrol car into a wide, open public park to take a quick lunch break out of the heat. They parked near a concrete building and rolled down the windows to catch a breeze. As they sat in the front seat eating, two people walked up silently from behind the car, exploiting the vehicle's blind spots. Without saying a single word, they pulled out heavy guns and shot both officers in the back of the head at point-blank range. The attackers then opened the doors, stripped the bleeding officers of their service weapons and handcuffs, and vanished into the city. Officer Kieswetter died instantly in the driver's seat. Her partner survived the shot but fell into a deep coma, fighting for his life in a hospital bed and unable to speak a single word to help his colleagues. The murder of a police officer triggered one of the largest manhunts in modern German history. A massive task force of over 70 detectives and forensic experts was assigned to a single mission: find the woman whose DNA was everywhere. The political and public pressure was intense. The police had to find these cop killers. Forensic teams spent days processing every inch of the patrol car. On the fabric of the rear seat and right along the edge of the plastic dashboard, they lifted a tiny trace of DNA. They rushed it under police escort straight to the state laboratory. The database returned a match. It was her. The same female profile from the 1993 teacup and the antique shop murder. Overnight, newspapers gave the mystery a name: the Phantom of Heilbronn. The government put up a massive €300,000 reward for her capture. The task force worked over 16,000 hours of overtime, chasing thousands of blind leads, phone calls, and tips from the public. Now, she wasn't just a thief or a robber, she was a cop killer. Europe believed they were hunting one of the most dangerous, elusive criminals in modern history. Profilers were losing their minds trying to understand the Phantom. Usually, serial criminals have a clear pattern. They have a specific motive, a clear way of operating, or a territory they stick to because they feel safe there. This woman tore up the textbook. According to the DNA trail, she was hanging out with violent neo-Nazi gangs one week, robbing houses with international car thieves the next, and wandering through rural Austria to break into trailers. She had no consistent motive, no clear signature, and no fixed address. Desperate for a breakthrough, Austrian labs ran a deeper analysis on the Phantom's DNA to trace her family roots. They wanted to know where in the world she came from. The data revealed a specific genetic profile most commonly found among populations from Eastern Europe and Russia. This new clue sent police forces into overdrive. Police chiefs concluded they were dealing with a massive international crime ring or an Eastern European mafia group. They launched incredibly expensive undercover operations, wiretapping phones and tracking migrant labor camps across borders. They swept up hundreds of people for questioning, completely unaware of the massive irony playing out in their labs. They weren't reading the genetic signature of a criminal mastermind. They were reading the family background of the innocent factory workers who packed their police supplies. But because DNA science was treated as an absolute dictatorship, detectives ignored physical reality. Whenever police actually caught the male thieves red-handed at these burglaries, they threw them into dark interrogation rooms, demanding to know where their female boss was hiding. The suspects wept, shook their heads, and swore under oath that there was no woman with them, that they had worked completely alone. The police didn't believe them. They assumed the thieves were simply terrified of this female supercriminal, keeping silent to protect a mastermind who would kill them if they talked. The system had decided the data was perfect, so the human truth didn't matter. By late 2008, the illusion began to fall apart. The Phantom's DNA began showing up at crime scenes that were flatly impossible, breaking the laws of logic and physics. Investigators were forced to confront 3 cases of absolute absurdity. The first happened during a routine armed robbery in 2005. A group of 3 young local boys broke into a small business, using a plastic toy pistol to scare the clerk and steal a tiny bit of cash. Police caught the boys blocks away, recovered the toy, and sent it to the lab for routine testing. The database flagged a match. The Phantom's DNA was covering the toy gun. Homicide detectives descended on the boys, accusing them of working for Europe's most wanted fugitive. The boys cried, insisting they had bought the plastic toy at a supermarket days before and had absolutely no idea who this woman was. The police were left trying to explain why a world-class cop killer was helping young boys rob small stores with plastic toys. The second contradiction happened when her profile was lifted from a stolen car in a different German city. But when fingerprint specialists looked at the physical prints left on the leather steering wheel, they realized something impossible. The physical prints belonged entirely to a male car thief who was locked in a jail cell on the night the vehicle was taken. The DNA was right there on the leather, but the prints belonged to a man who physically could not be on the street. The final breaking point arrived in France. A boat carrying undocumented asylum seekers capsized in rough waters, and a male victim drowned. French authorities recovered the body and took a routine DNA sample from his papers to identify him and send him home. The network processed the sequence. The system flagged an immediate match. The dead man's DNA matched the phantom of Heilbronn. The victim lying on the table in France was undeniably a man. Yet, the computer systems insisted he carried the exact genetic profile of Europe's most wanted female serial killer. Detectives were left with a scientific nightmare. The database was telling them that a dead man in a capsized boat in France was the same person who shot a police officer in Germany. As the contradictions piled up inside the investigation rooms, something bizarre happened outside them. The public and the media became more convinced than ever that the phantom was real. The mystery took on a life of its own, transforming into a massive obsession that dominated news cycles across Europe. Even though no living witness had ever seen her face, newspapers began printing dramatic sketches of what the phantom looked like. They drew a cold, calculating figure with sharp features and piercing eyes, a visual representation of the public's worst fears. Television specials featured panels of true crime experts who spent hours speculating on her background, her training, and how she managed to travel across borders completely undetected. Profilers constructed elaborate psychological theories. Some argued she was an elite, ex-secret agent from Eastern Europe who sold her skills to the highest bidder. Others theorized she was a contract killer hired by underground syndicates to clean up messy jobs, explaining why her DNA appeared at a murder scene and then vanished into a series of petty thefts. Law enforcement fell into the same trap, treating her as Europe's very first female supercriminal. She was discussed in morning police briefings as a near-supernatural adversary who possessed an impossible understanding of modern police tactics. The belief in her existence grew so powerful that whenever a difficult, unsolved robbery occurred anywhere in the region, the first question investigators asked was whether the phantom had struck again. Everyone trusted the digital readouts on a computer screen far more than basic common sense. In early 2009, investigators finally stopped looking at the crime scenes and started looking at the tools in their own hands. They conducted a step-by-step audit of their collection process, tracing a swab from the moment it entered inventory to the second it touched evidence. They quickly realized that every police department across Germany, France, and Austria bought their cotton collection swabs from the exact same international medical supply company, Greiner Bio 1. The swabs arrived at precincts inside double-sealed packaging. Investigators called them the Mercedes of cotton swabs, believing they were using the cleanest tools modern science could engineer. But they had completely misunderstood what the word sterile actually meant. Sterile doesn't mean DNA-free. It never did. Sterilization kills bacteria. It kills viruses. It kills fungi. But it does absolutely nothing to destroy human DNA. And that tiny misunderstanding had fooled 3 countries for 16 years. When the scandal broke, the manufacturer pointed directly to the product's warning labels. The packaging clearly stated that the swabs were meant for general medical use and hygiene testing. They were never certified for criminal DNA forensics. The ultimate failure belonged entirely to the police supply chain, which had been buying the wrong tools for 16 years without ever reading the fine print. Investigators decided to visit the factory themselves, traveling directly to the Greiner Bio 1 plant operating in Austria. They stepped onto the factory floor to see exactly how these swabs were put together. Their investigation led them straight to an elderly woman working on the packaging line. Her daily job consisted of manually grabbing large bundles of the manufactured cotton swabs and packing them into plastic shipping boxes. She wore standard factory clothing, but she did not wear full-body forensic suits or face shields. As she worked her long shifts under the warm factory lights, microscopic skin cells naturally shed from her hands and arms, drifting through the air and settling into the soft cotton fibers of the swabs before the plastic packs were sealed shut. Her genetic sequence was preserved perfectly inside the packaging, creating a time capsule of her own identity. Every single time a detective opened a fresh swab at a crime scene and wiped it across a piece of evidence, they weren't collecting the killer's trail. They were depositing the factory worker's skin cells directly onto the sample. The state labs tested the woman's DNA against the master file. The match was absolute. The woman investigators believed was an international criminal mastermind, an elusive shadow who had outsmarted 3 different national police forces, was nothing more than an innocent factory worker packing boxes for a living. In March 2009, the German public prosecutor stood before a room of journalists and officially declared that the Phantom of Heilbronn was a medical myth. The failure had cost European taxpayers millions of dollars, derailed dozens of active homicides, and turned the scientific community into a global laughingstock. But the greatest damage wasn't the financial waste or the embarrassment. While 3 nations spent 16 years chasing a woman who never existed, the real killers behind the brutal Heilbronn police shooting remained entirely free. Years later, a separate investigation revealed the devastating cost of the mistake. Investigators later concluded that Officer Michel Kieswetter had actually been targeted and executed by the National Socialist Underground, or the NSU, a violent, underground German neo-Nazi terrorist cell. The core leaders of the group, Uwe Bonhardt and Uwe Mundlos, carried out the execution in the park to obtain police weapons for their violent campaigns. Because the entire country's police machinery, profilers, and media outlets were completely blinded by chasing a ghost, the real killers had quietly slipped away from the park entirely unnoticed. They blended back into the population, remaining free to operate and plan their next violent attacks for 4 extra years without ever appearing on the police radar. This story answers a much more intriguing question than a standard true crime case. It shows how an entire continent spent 16 years hunting someone who never existed. DNA is one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigation, but this case proved something detectives would never forget. The evidence is only as reliable as the hands and the tools that collect it. What are your thoughts on how a single factory worker's routine shift protected a real-world terror cell? Drop your analysis in the comments below, and tell us where you're watching from, because we read every single entry. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this video to help us keep uncovering the evidence the system left behind. Thank you for watching the Forensic Strand. Stay safe, trust the science, and remember, time never washes a crime scene clean.